Welcome to Hip to the Scene. Talking music, videos, and everything in between.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andy Gesner, and I am welcoming you to episode 11 of Hip to the Scene. Every episode, we check in with an expert, someone who's been part of the music world for a long time, people who have really put all they've got into being a part of the musical mosaic. And today we are very excited to have a special guest, a dear friend from right here in the Great Garden State. Now, with over 3 decades of experience scribing impactful descriptions that floor the reader, Hip to the Scene is thrilled to welcome Tris McCall as our guest. Whether he's writing fiction novels like The Trespassers, blogging about New Jersey arts and politics on the Tris McCall Report, or covering Indie Nation's arts and entertainment scene through weekly contributions on NJ Arts, as well as the Jersey City Times, Tris has an abundance of sage wisdom, information, and firsthand insights, making him an excellent choice to provide some thoughts on today's frequently asked question. What is your motivation? Tris, welcome to Hip to the Scene.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's always good to see you, even if it's over a screen. It's still very nice.
Well, Tris, you and I have been pals for quite some time, and when it comes to writing about music, you really are a world-class, top-shelf music critic. You have, over many, many years, written about lots of great up-and-comers, but you've written about some of the biggest stars in the world. And I know that when you talk to some of these artists that you write about, one of the first questions you ask them is, what's your motivation? I'm curious, why is that question such a tough one for independent creatives?
I think it's a hard question for anybody, right? It's just a very difficult thing to understand, no matter what your enterprise is. But I think it's vital to understand what it is that drives you, because it's very frequently the key to getting to the bottom of the reason why your record or your small business or the book that you're writing, why it exists in the first place. Because the amount of labor that has to go into an artistic project is immense, and people who have never done it often underestimate it. They don't realize how much time is spent in the studio or in the woodshed trying to get better. Just putting your nose down and doing the work that needs to be done to even master the basics that you need to master in order to do something that's really extraordinary. Oh no, why would you put that time in? Why would you do that rather than do a million other things, a million more enjoyable ways to spend your life, to spend your time? There has to be something driving you. And I feel like frequently when you try to approach an interview or approach a review from that perspective, you can find the keys to unlocking the meaning of a recording or of a work of art, and also get some answers to why it might resonate for so many other people. So yeah, I do try to get around to that. It is always a question that's in my mind. I do always try to think, what motivates the artist to do what he or she is doing? Because it's a big lift, always, even if it looks like a small project.
I 100% smell what you're cooking, and I will share with you, over many decades of talking with great artists and bands, Some of the motivations that I have heard, Tris, and I want you to comment on them. Number one, I want to be famous.
I can anticipate what you're going to say. And fortune and fame is theoretically one of the reasons why people do what they do. And I mean, people will tell you, I'm in it for, or they'll even accuse somebody else of being in it for the money. But music is not where you would go right now if you were looking for fortune or fame. It's easier to get fortune or fame by just doing something on TikTok and trying to do something silly that people will then retweet. And many of the biggest songs in the world, especially in electronic music, are done by completely faceless artists who connect with millions of listeners and who will go to the recording studio tomorrow morning and do the same without any expectation of their faces being plastered on billboards. For every Taylor Swift in pop, there are thousands upon thousands of pop musicians who are successful in making a connection, but aren't famous. And as for fortune, well, you and I both know that music is not where you go for that. There are a million things that you can do with your time and with your career and with your day that will make you money. Music will usually cost you money. I think that the problem becomes that many musicians and many artists in general are asked to justify their existences by friends and family who say to them, "Why are you doing this?" And one answer is frequently, well, fame and fortune. It's an easy answer to tell people because it's an easy thing to wave away. But I found that very, very rarely is that sufficient to have somebody to put the work in to make a big project or even a small project. It's usually something else. But go on to your other numbers. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, how about I want to get signed to a record label?
It's kind of a version of the first thing, but it's in a way even worse, because if what you want to do is get signed to a record label, that really doesn't guarantee you much of anything. You're probably going to end up owing the record label a lot of money, and they might not even put your record out. These days, record label, while it can be great to get the cosign or the imprint on what you're putting out, it's often not sufficient to make what you're doing connect with anybody much. So, yeah, it's just, again, feels to me very much like something that you want to tell mom if mom was concerned about your life choices. Well, Mom, I got signed to a record label. And maybe she might get off your back for a few days. But chances are you're not going to get fame and fortune, and it's certainly not a motivation. I mean, if your motivation is to be part of a company, to be a company man, then join IBM. Or, no, maybe you can't join IBM anymore. Join Apple, join Facebook, join something else. If you want to be a company person, there are ample opportunities to do that. Being an artist is not the right way. You don't want to be. So I wouldn't believe somebody if they said, that's my motivation. My motivation is to be a cog in somebody else's machine. That artists are never, very, very rarely like that.
I think a lot of the folks watching this episode of Hip to the Scene, when they announce to their friends and family that they want to be an artist, a singer-songwriter, want to be in a rock band, or want to be a pop star, people will give you a look like, you really want to do that? Do you have any idea how much competition is out there? And I think a lot of the folks out there trying to get to the next level, they find impediments amongst the people within their purview. They're not disparaging, but perhaps, as we've all known, they will suggest maybe you want to try something that's maybe a little more safe, a little more of a guarantee that you'll be able to earn the income to have a happy and healthy life. What say you, Tris?
It's a hard conversation to have with people who are concerned about it. But this is what I always say. A very wise person once said to me, and a person who was himself a successful artist, he looked around the room that he was in, And he pointed to things. And he said, people don't realize this. Everything that you see in the built environment was designed by an artist. Everything you see. There's an artist behind everything. And every object, every design choice was made by an artist. So artists are obviously employed. And many of the professions that I was told to go into when I was a young person, I don't know whether they're very good professions to be in anymore. So I don't know whether it's really good advice or good career advice or good life advice to stay away from the arts if you're driven to do it. The reason to stay away from it is if you don't have the motivation to do it, because it is very painful. It's going to rake you over the coals, and you're going to be humiliated every day. You're going to feel every day that you're not up to the task, you're not up to the level that you need to be. That's the reason that I think that concerned people should tell you not to do it. If you don't have what it takes to really fail and fail and fail again to get whatever it is that's in your head, out of your head, and into whatever form it's going to take when it's going to interface with the public. If you don't have that, then probably something else would be better for you. But that's why you need to be motivated. Because if you don't have that motivation, if you're not driven by something to communicate, then it's going to wear you down. Practicing every day, constantly falling short of the level that you feel like you need to be at, constantly measuring yourself against the masters. That's the real danger of making the choice of the arts as a career. It's not necessarily that you're not going to make money. I mean, you're not going to make $1 million. You might not get famous. And maybe you would make $1 million, but it's going to be very rare. But everything in your life was designed by an artist. Somebody is out there doing stuff, and they are getting paychecks for that. And so that's something you could tell. That's really not the reason why you wouldn't want to do it. You wouldn't want to do it because of the psychological costs of constantly being in a position of not measuring up to the standard that all artists set for themselves.
What about artists and bands who will exclaim, all I really want is for the human family to hear my music? Does that get a little bit closer to what an artist's motivation should be?
A little bit closer, but it's also a bit tautological, because if you say the reason why I want people to hear my music is because I want people to hear my music, because I want everyone, and I'm motivated to get you to hear my music because I'm motivated to get people all over the world to hear my music. It's a bit of a restatement, and it doesn't really get at the reason why, the more important thing, which is the reason why your music, why your voice and not the voice of your neighbor. What is it that you have to say? But I do think that we've talked many times, we're both big fans of Elvis Costello. And Elvis Costello very honestly said, and part of this was just good publicity, but part of it was also, he's articulate, he always comes up with good nutshell descriptions of why he's doing what he's doing. And early in his career, he said that his motivations were revenge and guilt. And if you listen to those records, those early records, it's not all that you're going to find there. But yeah, definitely. Revenge and guilt were two of the things that were driving him to do what he did. Now, Elvis Costello had, like every other artist, had to go through a long period of time where nobody was listening to him, where he had to fail over and over, where he had to get to the level where his music could resonate for people. And through all that time, perhaps revenge and guilt were what were driving him. Now, other musicians might have altruistic motives, and I believe them when they say that they do. We're listening to Kendrick's most recent record, which seems to be driven by a desire to interrogate his own bad motivations and become a better person. And I believe him when I hear this record, when Mr. Morale, which is his latest album. I believe that that's true. I believe that that is a motivation, and I believe that motivation does come through powerfully. So the idea of spreading your voice to the world and making the world a happier place, that could be true. I don't think it's as true as often as musicians say it's true. I think frequently the motivation is something else. And when you do interview musicians who kind of lead with that, I think it's often helpful to try to get behind it. Does Katy Perry, for instance, is her motivation really up with people? I don't think it is. And I don't think it's helpful to understanding Katy Perry and why she connects with so many people to take her statements about universal love at face value. I think that we want to perhaps look at some of the uglier reasons why Katy does what she does and and why her music might ennoble some of those ugly reasons why she does what she does. And I think she's a songwriter who we've all listened to quite a lot. Her music has resonated for us quite a lot. And perhaps being a firework is not the altruistic thing that she says it is. Maybe she's being driven by something else.
Well, when I speak to artists, a lot of times they will tell me stories about how their friends, family, they will, in a kind way, and I know it happened to me, your music, it's too odd. It's too peculiar. You're way too hyper literate. Have you even considered maybe making music that is more commercial?
Yeah, but what does that mean, really? Especially in this especially in 2022. I mean, the biggest pop star in the world right now is Taylor Swift, who's an artist who I have enormous respect for. She was a new model of artists when she began, because nobody had pitched country music to that audience. She was also a tall woman, an awkward woman, and most importantly, she was a woman from the North making music in the South. So there were a million red flags. In fact, the artist was made out of red flags. So whoever was there who saw her and was willing to say, this is... So somebody, I'm sure, would... And there was also a belief that turned out to be completely erroneous, that she couldn't sing or that she couldn't project her music in a concert setting, which turned out to be just absolutely untrue. But I remember quite clearly at the time that there were many doubters who felt that way about her. So, I'm sure she was given advice to be, or told that her music wasn't as commercial as it needed to be, which is insane, because here she is, the most popular commercial artist in the world. Well, I just talked about Kendrick. This is an artist, Kendrick Lamar, an artist who makes enormously literate, enormously theatrical and involved and quite almost intentionally or unintentionally corny in the way, almost Broadway corny, the way his albums are put together. These albums are very intellectual. That you wouldn't necessarily listen to the music on these records and say that they're commercial, and yet they are enormous hits. And what we've learned over time is that the artists who really do make connections with people are the ones who are willing to do that, who are willing to put their intelligences and their peculiar brains out on the line for people. And that's true on an indie level. It's true for bands that don't connect with, that aren't trying to be worldwide, but are nevertheless trying to make connections. And think about Black Francis from the Pixies, for instance. When the Pixies first came out, people were like, what is this? This guy's talking. It's really weird. But it's because it was weird, and it's because it was an expression of an individual consciousness, not just his, but the other members of his group. It comes through on the record, and it resonates for people. So I think that, it's the most obvious cliche in the world, but you have to stay true to yourself, and you have to figure out what is driving you to do what you're doing. Because if you don't, once you do, then you're free to be fully you, and then people can connect with it. And I do think that it's always the case that whether it's an indie project or an enormous project, it's always going to be something that people say at first, oh, this isn't commercial. Because if you do sound like somebody else, chances are you haven't done that hard work of figuring out why the heck you're going through it. Why are you putting yourself through this? Why are you going to a recording studio and spending beautiful days in a room with no windows instead of throwing a Frisbee or whatever you could be doing if you were sane, rather than being an artist who is probably a little insane? But yes, you gotta be weird, because every individual brain, especially every individual great brain, is a weird brain. You look at the charts right now. People who have hit and made big connections, and people who have made small connections, they tend to be thinkers. They tend to be very theorized about what they're doing. That's not the case straight across the board, but it usually is. It usually is.
Well, everyone watching this episode of Hip to the Scene, it's very important that you know that when it comes to skilled wordsmiths in the world of music. Tris McCall, he is top shelf, world class. The New York Times, yes, the paper of record. What did they have to say about Tris McCall? They said he's the plugged in internet era muse of Jersey City. Tris, talk about your love of Jersey and specifically Jersey City.
Well, New Jersey is where I'm from. So for better or for worse, New Jersey is me. I never seriously considered about moving anywhere else. It's New Jersey made me, whatever I am. New Jersey is partially responsible. Jersey City is a city on the edge of New Jersey that's close to New York. And in some ways, it fancies itself a transition zone between New York and the rest of New Jersey. And it's very useful to live in Jersey City. If, for instance, you do a lot of work in Newark, or if you do a lot of work in New York City. Over the time that I've spent in Jersey City, and I've been here for many, I've been in Hudson County for 30 years now. During that time, it's changed a lot, and in some ways it hasn't changed at all. The way that it has changed is that the property values have gone up. And the consequence of the rise of property values to artists is that it's harder to afford to start a rock club, have a studio, get together with a band, do shows. It becomes very difficult because you have a club one day and the next day they put a condominium building up on the lot. That's really what we face in Jersey City as our challenge. It's hard for the scene to hang together because things change so quickly all the time. There's also the shadow of New York right across the river, siphoning away talent, and the fact that many people in Jersey City, frankly, think of themselves as New Yorkers. They think of themselves, they have more allegiance to New York than they do to have the rest of New Jersey. That's not me, but nevertheless, a lot of people do. The rest of New Jersey, I think, is freer to take on a Jersey personality, which is irascible, a little recalcitrant, a little unwilling to follow advice or listen to guidance. Or New Jersey is a good place for individual projects, maybe not a good place for individual promoters, but that's how we've survived. Valley of humility between two mountains of conceit. That's the line about New Jersey, and it's true. You got the shadow of the metropolis on one side of the Hudson, and on the other side of the Delaware, you have Philadelphia, which is, we often underestimate how huge Philadelphia is, and Philadelphia has been a great place to make music. So many great bands coming out of Philadelphia lately. So what we do is we lay low in many small fragmented communities, some of which don't even know about the other community next door, which is good and bad. It's bad because it would be great for us to have solidarity. It's good because our fragmentation helps us from being invaded from the consciousness of the monoculture, which is right on the other side of the river. We can very easily be absorbed into that. And yet we're not. We still have peculiar people in New Jersey, and chances are we always will, because that's just the Jersey mentality. And you get some of it in Jersey City, but maybe less. Maybe you get less. Maybe Jersey City is a little less Jersey, ironically, than the rest of New Jersey. Still a very fascinating place to be. And I think all transition zones are fascinating places to be. But if there's one thing that I could wish for my hometown, is that we hold on to more of the Jersey and we say about some of the New York.
Completely understood, Tris. And I must let the viewers and listeners know that the Star Ledger, the biggest newspaper in New Jersey, wouldn't have reached out to Tris McCall to become their music critic in the year 2010 unless he hadn't proved over the prior 2 decades that he had the goods when it came to writing about music. Tris, can you share with our audience some of the incredible bands and artists you had the opportunity to interview. And I'm guessing quite often it was because they were coming to the area to perform. And what does a talented creative like yourself with 4 records under your belt, what do you learn from these major international musical phenomenons?
I hope I've learned something from everybody that I've interviewed. I really do. And some of them are more forthcoming than others. But the nice thing about writing for the Ledger, when I wrote for the Ledger, was that you do get to write about legacy acts, basically, groups that you grew up with, because they aren't necessarily going to come to Jersey City to play a show, even at White Eagle Hall in Jersey City, because the space isn't quite big enough. But they do come to what we used to call the Garden State Arts Center. I think we probably still do. They come to Susquehanna. They come to Newark. They play the arenas. Sometimes they even play the stadia. And it is really cool to talk to legacy acts that you grew up with, because they're the ones that kind of formed your musical consciousness. So there's a lot to learn. And I feel like, my favorite band ever is the band Yes. That's my favorite band. I grew up listening to Yes. I still listen to Yes. That's the group that probably means the most to me. Yes and Genesis. And I wouldn't have got an opportunity really to talk to the members of those groups if I hadn't, or Fleetwood Mac, another group that I big when I was. These were bands that were popular well before I was born, but they're still there was on classic rock radio when you're young, and they kind of form the way that you think about music. And I did get to speak to the members of Fleetwood Mac individually and also as a group. And I remember very distinctly things that Stevie Nicks said about songwriting, about the way she approaches putting a band together. Anything that Stevie Nicks says is going to be something that I take very seriously. And yes, I got to speak to John Anderson a couple of times about his approach to music, his approach to lyrics, and what a lot of those lyrics from Yes songs that we're still thinking about them, what they might mean, how he puts a verse together. These people are the masters, and getting an opportunity to talk to masters, members of the Jefferson Airplane, P-Funk, people, which is huge in New Jersey, Plainfield, the people who were involved in George Clinton's projects, what that was like, talking to Bernie Worrell about synthesizers, about how he tackles putting a synth arrangement together. These people are the masters, and they kind of they came up with the alphabet, the P's and Q's that we face each other, and that we think about when we think about music. So that was really, really rewarding, and I loved the experience of doing that. It's not something that you want to do all the time, because you don't want to get in a spot where you're talking to artists who are looking back, because honestly, those artists might be a little more distant from their motivations than young artists are. It's really the young artists who are most profoundly motivated, because once you've made 10 classic albums, your motivation to make the 11th is going to be less than it would be if you haven't made any, but you feel like you have one that you must make. So I'm a little more interested in talking to that person than I am to the master, but there's still so much to learn from the masters, and it's great. They tend to be amazing people. They tend to be fascinating people. They've led fascinating lives, and still, in a lot of cases, they're still doing it. So, yeah, absolutely. It was.
Can you share with the audience, Tris, some of the biggest stars you've interviewed, and share with us if you might have been a little nervous before chatting with them?
I think that talking to members of the E Street Band, doing Springsteen, even in a press conference, it's a little nerve-wracking, because
I can imagine.
Well, just because of what he means to people in New Jersey. I think we all grow up with, we've all grown up under the sign of Bruce Springsteen, to use an astrological metaphor. He is definitely the way that we think about. When you think about how do you put together an album, all the intertextuality that he does on the albums, I thought that Taylor Swift's last 2 albums were tremendously Springsteen influenced. And it wasn't just because she has the guy from Still Train, Jack Antonoff, doing a lot of the doing production and playing instruments, or the guys from The National who are obvious Springsteen fans. I mean, we're all like that. Springsteen kind of gave us a way of thinking about what you're doing when you put an album together. And all of the members of his band. I do think that talking to the professor, Roy Bittan, a piano player from the E Street Band, as a piano player myself, was very intimidating. But here's a funny one. The one that was the most intimidating for me to do an interview of everybody who I ever interviewed, the one that was the hardest thing for me to wrap my mind around, was talking of all people, LL Cool J. Because when I talked to LL Cool J, the voice on the phone was the exact voice from Going Back to Cali. And it was really strange. I kept on thinking that he was about to break into song. It's funny. A lot of times when you talk to rappers, it is like that. But with LL Cool J, it really was like that. And I kept on being like, am I listening to a song? Am I listening to a record, or am I asking him questions? And it kind of kept taking me out of the interview. But I mean, that's a case where, for the most part, you kind of check, you say at the beginning, I really appreciate your work. Talking to him, Graham Parker is a musician who means a lot to me. Maybe doesn't mean a lot to everybody in the world, but he was one of my musical inspirations. One of the people who I think about when I try to sit down and write a song. So talking to Graham Parker was, in a way, I had to get up for that. And you mentioned before that Yes was my favorite band. Anytime you talk to your favorite band. Neil Finn from Crowded House. I hold his music in such high reverence. So that was definitely one where I was, again, not an artist who, a lot of people in the United States don't even really know who he is. But for me, it was definitely an experience of, there were reverberations there that aren't really there when you're talking to pop stars. Like, for instance, current pop stars don't really make you feel that way because they don't have the same kind of, you're kind of in the moment with them. It's kind of the difference between talking to a friend and talking to a priest. You can talk to a friend, you can really admire the friend, you can be attracted to the friend, you can love the friend, but you're kind of having an experience with the friend right now. And that's kind of how it feels when you're talking to somebody who has a song on the charts, the B.O.B., Bruno Mars, someone who right now has a song on the charts. Like, you might admire the heck out of it, but just like talking to a friend. Sometimes when you're talking to Suzanne Vega, someone whose music I grew up with, it's a bit more like talking to a counselor or a priest, someone who's been through it and who, you don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to really, you don't want to upset them. You don't want to say the wrong thing.
Well, as an excellent singer and songwriter, and someone who's put lots of attention to detail and meticulous care into crafting your albums, and being that you are a gifted music critic, what can you share with our audience when it comes to them being interviewed? I've had people say, Tris, can I get the questions ahead of time? And I really need to speak to you about this because I think for a lot of artists, they are petrified to talk about themselves. And I tell them, if you're not for yourself, who will be?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I totally know what you mean. It is scary being interviewed because what if you say something that then becomes like that New York Times quote, and that's been following me for a long time. What if you say something, or what if they say something about you? That's then you have to think about it. It's very easy for artists to feel like their work is reframed by writers, and it gets scary because what if the writer says something that undermines your confidence? But I think the thing to remember is that the writer is in a worse position than you are, because the writer is probably frightened too. The writer is probably doesn't know what to ask, doesn't know what to say, and has the responsibility of keeping the conversation going, coming up with something to ask, and might be straining. So I think the best thing to do is relax and talk about where you're from and what's meaningful to you. I find that talking about your geographical reality can be really helpful. Your neighborhood, your block. I think sometimes, we think now the music just comes from the internet, but every song comes from somewhere because everyone grew up somewhere. Even if the somewhere that you grew up feels like it was nowhere. You're in an edge city, or you grew up, at some intersection in the middle of nowhere. That's still somewhere. And you still have a unique story to tell about the relationship between your music and where you're from. And I think if you do that, first of all, you might find that you have something in common with the writer. They might know that place. It kind of lubricates the conversation, and it gives the conversation traction, I think. I always like that. And it's always something that I ask that question, because I like to know where the artist is coming from. Sometimes it's surprising. Sometimes there are musicians who are associated extremely strongly with New York. I'll give you an example. We think of Vampire Weekend as a New York band, and for good reason. They became famous in New York. They went to college in New York, and their attitude is very New York. But Vampire Weekend has very, very deep roots in New Jersey. And until you get to the Jerseyness of what they're doing, you don't really understand what they're doing. And I'm not even sure whether they talk about that very much in interviews. But I noticed that when they played at the Barclays Center, big show at the Barclays Center, at least one of the members of the band was wearing a New Jersey Nets uniform. And so it was there on his mind. Ezra, the singer from Vampire Weekend, is from Jersey. He's a Jersey guy. The piano player, who was no longer in the group, wasn't a Jersey guy, but at least half of the band was from Jersey. It's important to know these things, because even if you think that the person is from the metropolis, the story started somewhere. And when you get to the story, you begin to get to the motivation, the heart, why they're putting themselves through this. Like, why are you putting yourself through this? They open up, they start talking about that. The interview goes much better for everybody, I think.
Well, Tris, it has been such a pleasure speaking with you. And certainly this is not a softball question. In fact, when we initially spoke about trying to address this question, what is your motivation? It really had me ruminating, because I've been in the game now 42 years and my motivations have changed. And of course, 20 years living it, breathing it, sweating it. And then now 21 and a half years helping and teaching and guiding and advocating. It really is sometimes an incredibly difficult question to address. What is your motivation? But we are very hopeful that the viewers, the folks that are watching this episode of Hip to the Scene, that they leave a comment or maybe share with all the folks watching what their motivation is. What I do want to make sure everyone does, go to trismccall.net and you will see and read firsthand what makes Tris so special. trismccall.net. There's got to be 10 million words on that website, if not more.
There's a lot of words on the website, which gets to the question of what's my motivation? Why can't I stop writing? And that's a question I've been asking myself for a really long time. Like, what am I doing? What is it that compels me to put aside everything and just write? And but I do. I mean, I have it. I write a lot. So if you do go to the website right now, first of all, when you go to the website right now, the first thing that you're going to see is an article about Phil Collins, of all people, because it was the end of our evaluative period. And I felt like I wanted something to say about Phil Collins. I love Phil Collins. I'm a big fan, but that's what you find. But if you keep scrolling, it's true. It's a lot of words. And there's a lot of words that aren't on that website that I've written, because I've been writing for a really long time, and we'll see how much longer I can keep it up. It seems like by now I should be dry, but apparently I'm not, because it seems like there's more to come. So it's not just you. It's not just you. I have to ask myself that question every day. What's my motivation? Why am I doing this and not any number of other things? It's beautiful outside today. You know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to write. Why?
Absolutely. And today is just a 9.5 here in the Great Garden State. And as much as I'd like to go out and enjoy it, Tris, I'm going to get back to my desk and continue to fight the good fight for all the incredible artists, bands, singer-songwriters, EDM producers that have come to me and my team and asked for our assistance. And Tris, I'm sure you can agree, if you love your job, you'll really never work a day in your life.
It is the way to think about it. Yes, absolutely. And if you're psychologically compelled to do the job when you have no choice, then maybe that's not work. Maybe it's something else. Maybe a different metaphor needs to be used, something more, along the lines of breathing. You don't think about it, but you got to do it. So.
Indeed. And I heard a rumor there's going to be some Tris McCall performances later on in 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to crafting incredibly well polished, maybe not polished, but just wonderfully memorable pop songs, Tris, you've definitely got the gift. Is it true we're going to see some Tris McCall later in 2022?
I think my gift is a weird gift. It's a gift that you find under the Christmas tree in the back. It's not in the front. It might be wrapped a little funny, but I do think people enjoy playing with it when they unwrap it. And yes, I'm going to be doing a couple of shows. There are a couple of Tris McCall albums, if you're interested, that have been unreleased that I think are going to be released soon. And it's a lot of music that is that's been backed up. I think, like everybody else, the pandemic made it very difficult for me to perform. I didn't want to be doing indoor performances. It didn't seem to make any sense. It made it difficult for me to get those songs out to people. But I think that's changed. And if we can do stuff outside, I think we're going to do some stuff outside. So, I'll let everybody know when it happens. Well,
I will tell everyone I am a Tris McCall super fan. You can go back 23 years and listen to If One of These Bottles Should Happen to Fall, and you will be so pleased that you do. Or you could go to something more recent like the Tris McCall Almanac. Who does things like this? It's Tris. And I really do encourage everybody watching not just to read Tris. Certainly, you should listen to Tris. The music is captivating. It takes you someplace wonderful. And Tris, let's just keep fighting the good fight. And many thanks, my dear friend, for being a guest on Hip to the Scene.
Thank you. Thank you for talking to me. It's been a lot of fun. Always fun to talk to you, Andy. It really is. Thank you.
Likewise. And anyone watching, if you want to find out more or watch past episodes, all you have to do, there's a subscribe button that's coming up on the screen right now. Please subscribe for more episodes. I get it. We're only at episode 11, but there are more coming. And we're going to answer more of the questions that we know you, the viewer, are hoping to have answered. So we appreciate you tuning into this episode. What is your motivation? With the one and only Tris McCall. And Tris, go out and enjoy the day today.
Thank you.
Right away,